As the 19th century drew to a close, Europe was a continent on the brink. A complex web of political, social, and economic tensions were simmering beneath the surface. Nationalism was on the rise as each nation sought to assert its power and identity. This fervor was not confined to Europe but spilled over into the scramble for colonies as European powers sought to expand their empires across the globe. This territorial ambition fueled a fierce competition, a race for resources, prestige, and strategic advantage. The world was no longer a chessboard for kings and queens, but a high-stakes game for nations clamoring for dominance. The stage was set, and the actors ready. But the real catalyst was the entangled system of alliances, friendships forged in the grand halls of power, promises whispered in hushed tones, and treaties signed in the dead of night. An intricate network of mutual defense pacts and secret agreements that bound nations together in a precarious balance of power. In this tense atmosphere, the spark that lit the fuse was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. The ripple effect of this single event was staggering. The complex system of alliances kicked into gear, dragging nation after nation into what would become the most devastating conflict the world had ever seen. The guns of August roared, and the world was plunged into the chaos of World War I. The Great War, as it was known, was a cataclysm of unprecedented scale and brutality. It was a war that would redefine the very concept of warfare, introducing the world to the horrors of trench warfare, chemical weapons, and mechanized death on an industrial scale. As the war raged on, the leaders of the world watched with growing unease. The old order was crumbling, and a new one was taking its place. The world was changing, and they knew that they had to change with it. With a world at war, the stage was set for a treaty that would rock the globe. From 1914 to 1918, the world witnessed a conflict of unprecedented scale and devastation. It was a time when mankind's ingenuity, instead of being harnessed for progress, was deployed to create new and terrifying ways to wage war. World War I, also known as the Great War, forever changed the face of warfare and the world itself. In the early stages of the war, the Western Front became a stalemate. A network of trenches snaked 450 miles from the North Sea to the Swiss border. This was trench warfare, a brutal and drawn-out form of combat where soldiers lived, fought, and often died in squalid conditions. Territory was won and lost by mere yards, and the cost in human lives was staggering. Then, there was the introduction of weapons that brought a whole new level of terror. Chemical warfare, a grim innovation of the Great War, claimed countless lives. Mustard gas, chlorine, and phosgene filled the air, blurring the line between the battlefield and a living nightmare. Soldiers donned gas masks, not as a choice, but as a necessity for survival. The Eastern Front, too, was a theater of immense suffering and loss. Here, the Central Powers clashed with Russia in a series of battles that led to the loss of millions of lives, and ultimately, the collapse of the Russian Empire. Across the globe, from the trenches of Europe to the deserts of the Middle East, the war raged on. It was a war that saw the fall of empires, the birth of nations, and a loss of life that numbed the world. An estimated 9 million soldiers and 7 million civilians died as a direct result of the war. Families were shattered, societies disrupted, and the world was left to grapple with a loss of a magnitude it had never before experienced. As the guns fell silent, the victors gathered to decide the fate of the defeated. The stage was set for what would become the Treaty of Versailles, a peace agreement that would shape the 20th century in ways no one could have predicted. In the halls of Versailles, a new world order was being forged. As the guns fell silent, the world's major powers gathered in the Paris Peace Conference, each bringing their own agenda to the table, each hoping to shape the post-war world according to their own vision. The United States, under the leadership of President Woodrow Wilson, came with his 14 points, a blueprint for a peaceful world. The cornerstone of his plan was the creation of a League of Nations, an international body designed to prevent future conflicts. But the European powers were more interested in punitive measures against Germany, the aggressor in their eyes. France, having suffered the most during the war, was intent on weakening Germany to such an extent that it could never wage war again. Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau was adamant about imposing heavy reparations on Germany, both as a punishment and as a means to repair the devastated French economy. The United Kingdom, led by Prime Minister David Lloyd George, found itself caught between these two visions. Lloyd George was aware of the need for a just peace that would not sow the seeds of future conflicts, But he also had to satisfy the British public's demand for retribution against Germany. The resulting document, the Treaty of Versailles, was a compromise that satisfied no one completely. Its most controversial provision, the War Guilt Clause, placed the blame for the war squarely on Germany's shoulders, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. The reparations demanded of Germany were astronomical, crippling the German economy and sowing the seeds of resentment among the German population. These decisions, designed to ensure peace, ironically laid the groundwork for the next great conflict. On June 28, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed, sealing the fate of nations. The ink was dry, but the repercussions of Versailles were just beginning. As the world breathed a sigh of relief, the Treaty of Versailles emerged as a beacon of hope, promising a new era of peace and cooperation. The establishment of the League of Nations, a groundbreaking organization dedicated to resolving international disputes through dialogue, was one of the key outcomes. The League was a symbol of a new world order, but it was an order that was far from perfect. The treaty was also a catalyst for simmering discontent, particularly in Germany. The terms of the treaty were seen as punitive and harsh, leaving the German nation humiliated and economically crippled. The War Guilt Clause, which placed the blame for the war squarely on Germany's shoulders, was particularly galling. This discontent was a fertile breeding ground for resentment and revenge, and it wasn't long before a dark figure emerged from the shadows, promising to restore Germany's pride and power. Adolf Hitler, a little-known figure in the immediate post-war years, seized upon this national sentiment. With his fiery rhetoric and promises to tear up the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler won over the hearts and minds of a disgruntled populace. The stage was set for a new conflict, one that would dwarf the horrors of the Great War. In the years that followed, the weaknesses of the Treaty of Versailles became painfully evident. The League of Nations, despite its lofty ideals, proved ineffective in preventing conflicts. Its inability to enforce its decisions, coupled with the absence of key world powers like the United States, significantly weakened its influence. Meanwhile, Germany, under Hitler's iron fist, was rapidly rearming and preparing for war. The seeds sown by the Treaty of Versailles were sprouting into the most destructive conflict the world had ever seen, World War II. The echoes of Versailles still reverberate in our world today. In its aftermath, we're reminded of the importance of diplomacy, understanding, and fair negotiation in maintaining global peace. The Treaty of Versailles was more than a peace agreement. It was a pivotal moment in world history. Indeed, this monumental event was a cornerstone that marked the end of the war to end all wars, the Great War, World War I. A conflict that was sparked by a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and tensions between the world's leading powers. It was a war that was fought not just on the battlefield, but also on the home front, affecting civilians in ways never seen before. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles, was a symbol of hope, an aspiration for a world of peace. The major provisions of the treaty were designed with the aim of preventing future wars. Germany was held responsible for the war and had to face severe penalties, including giving up territories, reducing its military, and paying hefty war reparations. This was a form of punishment, but also a method to ensure the balance of power in Europe. However, the aftermath of Versailles was far from peaceful. The harsh penalties imposed on Germany led to economic hardship and resentment among its people, setting the stage for the rise of Adolf Hitler and the onset of World War II. On the other hand, the establishment of the League of Nations, a precursor to the United Nations, was a significant consequence of the treaty. It was an attempt to foster international cooperation and maintain world peace, although it ultimately failed to prevent another world war. The Treaty of Versailles thus teaches us about the complexities of peace agreements and the unintended consequences they can have. It reminds us of the delicate balance of power in international relations, the profound impacts of war, and the enduring quest for peace. As we reflect on the past, we gain insights for the future. Until next time, keep exploring history.